Hello, everyone. Welcome to the DI 101 webinar series. My name is Jared Evans. I'm the Director of Marketing for Distribution International. If you are new to the DI 101 webinar series, I will tell you that it is an incredible resource offered to DI customers, partners, and associates. By partnering with our manufacturers and our industry experts, these webinars deliver informative presentations about industry trends, new technology, new products, and product applications. In order to fully support our customers, Distribution International offers products and solutions from multiple manufacturers and brands in many product categories. This webinar does not represent an endorsement of one manufacturer or brand over another. We pride ourselves in partnering with manufacturers that deliver products of the highest quality to our customers. We are extremely excited to welcome our strategic manufacturing partner, Johns Manville, for today's presentation. Our presenter is Cory Tuttle. He is the Global Category Leader for Global Procurement and Logistics for Johns Manville. He is going to discuss how we kind of got to our current situation in terms of supply and demand and inflation. He's going to discuss how it is affecting our industry and what we might see in the future. So we are really excited about this. I think this is a topic that everybody has some interest and has a stake in right now. So we are proud to have Cory and JM today. We also do have a few panelists that will be available to help answer questions, and those include Lance Bonin, Lori Roy, and Eric Alley, all from Johns Manville. So we appreciate them for their time today. We will field questions at the end of the webinar. To submit questions, you can use the Questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. You can submit your questions at any point during the webinar, and we will simply answer them at the end of the session. So without further delay, I will turn this over to Cory Tuttle with Johns Manville. Cory?
Thank you very much, Jared. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day today to talk a little bit about the current state of both supply and demand, and then its corresponding impact on inflation. Okay, so brief round of introductions. Again, as Jared had called out, my name is Cory Tuttle. I'm a global group category manager for Johns Manville. I've been with JM since July of last year, but have about 10 years worth of experience in the automotive and now construction manufacturing environments, all of which have been with global procurement in some form or fashion. So as Jared mentioned, just a brief review of the agenda to really talk about what we're going to see in today's environment. It first helps by taking a step back to try to understand the things that got us here. What were some of the key drivers behind both from demand and a supply perspective that put us in this position? We'll also look at kind of the current state of today and really address, have any of those variables changed since the pandemic began? We'll also have a brief touch point on the Russia-Ukraine war, which I know is very highly covered from a geopolitical perspective, but we'll also try to take a little bit of stock as to the impact it's going to have on the US marketplace. And then finally, we'll close with just a brief summary on the takeaway points from all of this and try to put into context what JM's belief the outlook for tomorrow is going to look like. Okay, so firstly, as we start, inflation, how did we get here? I'm sure all of you have felt the effects in some form or fashion over the last 18 months. So really, the first part of this conversation, we're going to start looking at it from the demand and the supply viewpoints to really help understand what are the things that contributed to the rapid inflation we've all been experiencing today. So firstly, as we talk about the demand side of the equation, one of the things that we have to keep in context as we talk about why we're seeing such rapid inflation today is that, frankly, the US consumer and others globally have been able to accumulate what we call an excessive amount of savings. Now, there's a number of reasons for this. There are certainly the federal stimulus payments that greatly contributed to the US consumer. There have been other measurements put in place to ensure ultimately that they are protected as a consumer as we were going through quite an uncertain period of demand here for the US and others as the pandemic was in its early stages. And so by the end of 2021, what effectively that meant in terms of excess savings was the equivalent of about $2.7 trillion US. Now, to put that, yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I don't believe your slides are changing, at least on our end. Just wanted to let you know.
Hang on. Thank you so much. Let me make sure that I'm. Thanks for that, Jared. 1 second. Jared, is that better? Can you see my screen?
I can see your screen. It's just not in presentation mode. There we go.
Okay, we back? Okay, apologies for that. We'll go ahead and get started. Little technical difficulties here. So again, to restart the first component of what I'll call the consumer demand picture, there's a significant amount of extra cash that had been accumulated by the U.S. consumer over the course of the pandemic. That number reached roughly 2.7 trillion U.S. dollars by the end of 2021. To put that into perspective, if you just look at that across the population of the United States, that would essentially come out to be about $8,000 per U.S. citizen. So if we're thinking about the components of driving inflation, the first step has simply been extra money floating around in the marketplace. So certainly, as we look about that, we now have a consumer base that has been adequately supplied in terms of money, with the expectation that that money would be spent. So then the next component of certainly the inflationary environment that we've seen is, where are the consumers going to be spending that money? So if we think then about some of the other phenomena that occurred throughout the pandemic, we saw significant reductions and or cessations of certain activities out of fear of contracting the virus, most notably going to bars, going to restaurants, going to sporting events, movie theaters, etc. That activity, or otherwise known as services, effectively cratered in terms of its availability to the consumer. So we now have a consumer base that has been well supplied in terms of extra savings and is now sitting on a cushion of money. They also can no longer spend that money on services. The only other option in that environment is now to spend that money on goods. And you can see that here in the trend listed in the graph here to the right, essentially the divergence of the spending patterns of the US consumer versus trend over the course of pandemic. And you can see essentially how great that gap had become by the end of, say, 2021. Now, in a normal environment with stable supply, this is potentially a good thing for a producer of goods, right? You think that incremental demand would yield incremental benefits. But as we're going to show in successive slides, this trend and this divergence and rapid divergence actually ended up becoming a pretty significant problem for manufacturers. The second thing we'll call out when we talk about the divergence of these trends is also the way in which those goods were purchased, in that a large majority and a structural majority of those goods were beginning to be purchased online. And so the rise of e-commerce and the effects of buying goods online and having those delivered, we'll also talk about the effect that that had on the overall logistics industry, which, long story short, made life slightly difficult. Now, with regard to material supply, one of the things that we want to call out here from a supply perspective is, at the same time that consumers were feeling uncertain about their outlook and their ability to support families, producers were also feeling similar levels of uncertainty with regard to the demand picture in the future. And so, as consumers, being good stewards of their businesses, took certain actions to ensure that they could protect themselves from any type of market situation. And in this case, that led to significant reduction of inventories. That led to curtailments or elimination of production overall. And in certain cases where severe, it even led to furloughs or full-time reduction in workforce. to try to weather the storm of an uncertain demand environment. And the way we'd represent that, if you look at the graph on the right, you'll see that gray band represents about a 5-year range of operating rates for U.S. refineries. Now, we use U.S. refineries here as a bit of a proxy for the manufacturing sector just because of how pervasive petroleum products are in today's market. But you can essentially see in 2020, that range and that reset of the 5-year range, that was directly a function of the actions being taken to try to preserve the business throughout the beginning stages of COVID. Now, what we then saw as a result is once the consumer had now been given this extra money to spend and could not instead spend that money on services and began to spend on goods, slowly those demand signals began working their way back through the value chain. And once that happened, producers have already found a way to potentially take out all the extra fluff that they may have had in their inventory, extra fluff they may have had in their production schedules, and now found themselves in a position of need to try to play catch up. And certainly when you curtail production and you lay off staff, bringing that back online is not something that happens overnight, nor does it happen instantaneously or to the same extent that we can. So at some point, staff that had been laid off or retired decided not to come back into the workforce, which exacerbated problems further. And so we essentially found that as we got into the later part of 2020, producers had been playing this game of catch up as demand continued to accelerate. Now, on top of this, we had an incredibly severe market shock in Winter Storm Uri, which is in that red circle you'll see for early 2021. And if you think of the effect that Winter Storm Uri had, that essentially hit a brand new low in terms of refinery operating rate that hadn't been seen in decades. So on top of producers in general trying to play catch up with regard to meeting this incremental demand, this market shock only exacerbated and made that problem worse. Now, we would think that in an environment where we have significant strength in demand and where we have an inability to supply, that would incent producers instead to begin talking about adding capacity and trying to meet that incremental demand. Well, one of the other noticeable trends that we saw as a result of COVID was a significant amount of discipline out of a majority of producers of products. And that was directly related to some prior learnings from the past decade where demand was matched with incremental supply almost instantaneously or as close to instantaneous as was possible. That's represented if we look at the graph on the right. And I want to call out a couple of trends. The first of which is the correlation between the oil price, which is in our purple blue bar or purple blue line, and how that compares to the rig count, which essentially the amount of rigs that are in the ground ready to pump oil to support incremental growth in supply. Those effectively had traded in sync with each other all the way up until 2020, at which point those producers and those two graphs began to diverge. The reason for that is if you look at the year 2014 to 2015, there was a significant increase in oil that had been brought to the marketplace, which effectively cratered the price of WTI. And that was a direct result of supply trying to match pricing, but it was also a result of producers' behavior in trying to support that demand instantaneously. What we're seeing now, and one of the reasons we're seeing elevated price pressures and prolonged price pressures vis-a-vis prior cycles, has simply been that producers have learned from some of those mistakes of the past and are either choosing to delay investment decisions to try to put more supply into the market, or instead they're taking that capital and being told that they have an ability to better return value to shareholders through things like buybacks. So the way of dealing with the response to these strong demand signals, the discipline being provided by producers is structurally on a different level than prior cycles, which again is contributing to some difference in behavior and ultimately prolonged prices. Another way to call this out, there was an investor call with Weyerhaeuser, who's a very large producer of lumber. They control lumber mills, they have forestry products, and they also control forests by which they get their raw material. The CEO was asked point blank, in the face of staggering prices of timber, hey, do we see an expectation that you're going to increase capacity? And the blunt response back to that analyst was, investing at the top is a great way to lose money. And so if we think about that behavior and that comment, it essentially is endemic of what we're beginning to see out of producers, and certainly something that is adding to the delays and adding to the price challenges and pressures that we're all feeling. So next, moving on to energy. Energy is an interesting marketplace in that up until a few years ago, it was very much dictated by the fundamentals of the United States market. So a bad winter in the Northeast would increase prices, a good winter in the Southeast would depress prices, but it was very much controlled within our own boundaries. Now, in the last couple of years, a couple of things have happened that have effectively globalized the natural gas marketplace, which is adding pressure to prices. Firstly, we have incremental demand coming from places like Europe. Europe had a couple of issues last year that contributed to essentially a rapid need for US exported LNG. The first of which were supply of their renewable sources of energy, notably wind, were not providing the same levels of output that they had anticipated in support of their typical generation to support their end consumers. Now, when that happens, as has happened before, Europe's first port of call up until that point had been Russia for LNG. Now, coincidentally, LNG from Russia had also been a challenge, as Russia had been importing less and less, or exporting less and less to Europe. So that only added to the concerns and only added to the needs of LNG requirement from Europe. And because they couldn't get that material from Russia, they instead decided that they were going to get that from the US, which again pressured prices, because if you're a producer of LNG, you can either sell it into the US market, or you can be paid more to send that product over to Europe. The second major driver of demand, or second major driver of demand and thus prices for US natural gas, has essentially been the incremental consumption of China as they continue to convert their dirty coal production over to natural gas sources. And essentially right now that is being done in excess of what China is able to produce. So China is becoming an increasing importer of natural gas, and the US is well positioned to provide that. So all of these things effectively have contributed to essentially the US marketplace becoming more driven by global fundamentals as opposed to local fundamentals. And then finally, and arguably the most difficult of all three variables, which is logistics. Logistics has multiple issues that are plaguing the industry, some of which we'll consider to be temporary with regard to things like equipment. We know that van production, tractor production is constrained for a lot of the same reasons that the automotive industry has been having issues with production, notably semiconductors, similar raw materials, et cetera. The structural issue, however, remains the availability of labor willing to work in the truck driving space. So right now, the average age of a truck driver in the US market is 55 years old. And so if we think about the fact that there are an aging workforce in the trucking industry without a corresponding increase in young supply to offset those drivers as they age out, as they retire, it's continuing to shrink the labor pool of those who are willing and interested to take these jobs. In addition to this, for that supply of labor that still exists, they're also now prioritizing a different type of truck move, which is more built around local warehouses and local daily routes, as opposed to multi-day long distance trucks. So simply put, if you can be paid the same amount as an Amazon employee to deliver packages for the day and be home at night, that's going to be simply more beneficial than taking a cross-country route to deliver a same load for the same amount of price, the same pay. So again, we're seeing some significant changes here in the logistics market, and we believe in terms of the three that we've called out, structurally, this is going to be the most difficult to solve. So with all that put into context, what is the impact of a consumer that has extra money and is spending on goods, coupled with challenges in supply of materials and logistics? Ultimately, that's going to lead to higher prices. And so if we think about this, and we'll look at the producer price index as just a good barometer of what that looks like, you'll see that since the pandemic, the producer price index, which is an aggregation of US producer inputs, has risen 26% since the start of 2020. Now, that seems to be a pretty large number until you consider the impact that the same dynamics we've just discussed have had on the construction industry. And so if we look at that same index specifically to construction materials, which is a space much more aligned to John's Manville, we see that that same index is actually up 46% since the start of the pandemic, which is an argument to say that the effects of the tightness in supply, the challenges, and the corresponding demand have led to even more acute price pressures in this space relative to other industries. Now, the one thing I'm also going to call out, we will cover it in successive slides. This PPI at the time that this was taken had not incorporated any effect on the Russia-Ukraine war, which again, we're going to touch on here in a little bit. And then finally, last but not least, the Cass Freight Index, again, pervasive. We did talk about the structural changes in demand, the structural changes in labor supply, and this index in terms of freight rates is also up 50% since the pandemic. So again, all the things that we brought to essentially has led us to this incredible inflationary environment that we're all in. And certainly, you know, I think everybody on this call has seen these pressures in some form or fashion as you go about your daily lives, either professionally or personally. So it's been a bit of a grim story and certainly not a good look up until this point. So now the question is, has anything changed since, you know, we've taken all these readings and taken the pulse of the market? And I would say the short answer is it's a bit of a mixed bag, and we'll cover that here in a second. So firstly, going back to the consumer, what has changed with regards to how the consumer is looking at things from a health perspective and from a consumption patterns perspective? And we'll start to notice some things that are potentially a good sign for the industry. The first of which, we called out all those excess savings that the consumer had accumulated throughout the course of the last couple of years. That was their ability to go purchase above parity and give them the ability to handle things like, you know, price increases. What we're seeing now in terms of the consumer is that a lot of that excess savings has dissipated, and that consumers' cash balances are starting to come back in line with what we'll call normal trends. So the consumer is still saving money. They're still doing a good job of putting away for a rainy day, but it's just not at the same pace or at the same veracity that we saw as a result of the pandemic. Secondly, we're also beginning to see a return back to normal in terms of consumption patterns. And that is directly linked to the economy reopening, to services being more accessible as we work our way out of the pandemic. And so you'll see that trend here in the graph to the right, and that elevated retail sales trend, or in this case, goods consumption trend, is starting to fall back in line with kind of where we were at pre-pandemic. So in terms of the consumer, we're starting to see a little bit of alleviation and a little bit of sign of normalcy that's coming. Now, in a normal environment, this should typically mean that there's going to be an ability to recover quickly, but we'll see in future cases that we're not quite there in terms of manufacturers. So with regard to materials, you know, we mentioned the consumer is starting to fall back in line with production, right? So demand and supply are becoming a little more imbalanced. However, the challenge we're seeing is still that inventories across the value chain are incredibly low. So we're at the point where we're beginning to see an ability to support the customer on their needs, but in terms of incremental growth, in terms of extra, there's not enough slack in the value chain, be it at the petrochemical producers, through the refiners, to the manufacturers, to really support anything going wrong or any incremental demand. So really, hand to mouth is probably the best way to describe where we're at today. Now, the one exception, obviously, in terms of production levels, semiconductors, we do have to call that out. That sector is actually continuing to worsen. We will talk about that in the next couple of slides. With regard to energy, again, this is another graphical representation of essentially the same message. So if you look at the graph to the left, we're seeing production levels hit 5-year records as it pertains to natural gas. And so in theory, in a balanced market, we'd be able to overproduce relative to demand, and that would begin to build back our inventories. Well, if you look at the graph to the right, you'd actually see that we're not exactly getting to the point where we're able to do that, right? We're still not able to rebuild any of the inventory that we need to support a healthy market because that extra demand is still getting soaked up by incremental, incremental supply is being soaked up by incremental demand. And then with regard to logistics, the probably the next big watch out on the horizon. Logistics arguably is in a worse state today than it was in 2021. So we did mention that those labor shortages are continuing to persist, but the next big hurdle as we look at international logistics is with regard to the backlog of ports that have essentially been engulfed, not just in the West Coast Long Beach area, but also, you can see how well that's becoming distributed across the globe. The new risk that we all need to be cognizant of is on July 4th, the ILWU, the longshoremen, that labor contract is up. Currently, that longshoreman agreement represents 22,000 workers and ports from essentially the entire western seaboard, from Port Bellingham, Washington, all the way down to San Diego. And so as of July 1st, that contract, if it's not signed to the point where we have a new deal in place, there is a risk that the western seaboard could be further disrupted in terms of taking on containers. And so again, we've already mentioned that we haven't had a chance to recover, nor have we had a chance to get healthy. This is about the worst time we could potentially have any kind of strike activity from the labor market, from the longshoremen's group. So the other concern is certainly we hear the comments made by the longshoremen in the group. The ILWU has already sent communiques to their employees, advising them to, quote, be prepared and to save money in preparation for a pending battle. So very much that group is aware of the dynamics of the environment today and is going to be using that to their advantage. Now, we have seen in similar situations where other labor unions have come to an agreement, most notably the Canadian Pacific. That was actually a rail workers union that was locked out by this Canadian Pacific on March 20th, so this Sunday morning. It took them about 48 hours post-lockout to come to an agreement. So it's not to say that something can't happen, nor that it won't happen, but it is to say that any potential impact with regard to strike activity is going to have a drastic effect and will continue to add to the inflationary pressures that we're seeing here in the US marketplace. Okay, so now to talk about the war on Ukraine and the corresponding impact. We'll cover two specific materials. Again, there's a lot of different ways that we can take this, but we tried to pick two specific categories to essentially give everybody insight as to what this means for the US. The first thing to call out, obviously, is oil. Russia is the third largest producer of oil globally, and so their essentially ability to support the marketplace, both good and bad, taking that capacity offline has a significant effect on corresponding oil prices. Now, the thing to note, and this will also be applicable for the next slide, there has been no official sanction on Russian energy to Europe, to the US, or otherwise. However, there are producers and refiners that are reluctant to buy Russian oil and reluctant to buy Russian energy for the threat of sanctions that have not come yet, and also because of the public outcry, essentially arguing against the need for it and asking consumers and asking refiners to go find that product elsewhere. So what does that mean for us? There are scenarios that have been put out in the marketplace ranging as high as $200 a barrel if we're talking about a worst case scenario. Right now, our mid case essentially has taken our projections up by about 64% from original outlook in 2022, which is about right now around 130 a barrel. And all of that is to suggest that petrochemical derived products are going to continue to see inflation in the US, despite the fact they may not be directly impacted by the fundamentals going on in the Ukraine war. So certainly anybody who's exposed to the petrochemical value chain is going to feel this. It may not have been immediately noticed yet, but it's certainly something that is going to be hitting the consumer here in the next month or two. Then looking at aluminum or metals in general, again, Russia is a large exporter of aluminum. This one is particularly of note to producers and consumers in the US because aluminum was already a subject of Section 232 tariffs, whereby about 65% of the global marketplace is already subject to about a 25% tariff and or a quota. So the US is already dealing with a tight market. Russia was not on that sanctions list or was not on that tariff list. So taking that 6% offline effectively again, through the same method of self-sanctioning, has just led to incremental price pressures on this commodity as well. So we already had a really tight market in aluminum, and the self-sanctioning we're seeing has just effectively made this worse. Now, the other thing to call out we haven't made mention of up at this point with regard to the automotive marketplace, the logistics marketplace, Ukraine is also one of the world's largest suppliers of neon gas, which is a key component that is used in semiconductor production. So on top of some of the structural issues that we have seen, this war is also leading perhaps to exacerbation in the semiconductor supply chain and further complications in terms of their recovery. So finally, what does this all mean, and where are we going from here? So in summary, as we look at it from the three major categories of variables, materials bottlenecks, those are going to exist, but frankly, a lot of that is still based on the Russia-Ukraine war. So anything we're seeing in terms of short-term supply shock has been directly resulted in taking that capacity offline in the short term. In terms of actual petrochemical production in the US, production levels, as we mentioned, are getting back to a state of health. However, inventories are still too low to handle any kind of volatility that could and may inevitably impact the marketplace going forward. In terms of energy, again, in a good position from a supply stability perspective, but the marketplace globally is going to continue to command a premium and is going to continue to pressure exports of LNG over to other parts of the world, notably China and Europe, and that is going to continue to pressure US prices going forward. And then finally, logistics. Logistics is arguably the bottleneck amongst the three items and will be the longest and hardest component to solve because of both temporary issues such as components, but then also structurally the availability of labor to step in and really take the jobs that need to be filled to support the growth in the current marketplace. So with all that in mind, it's our estimation that when you put these factors into consideration, logistics is going to be a thing that finishes and comes back into balance last. And right now, as we would see that recovery is anticipated in 2024 at the earliest. So with that, I will step back. And Lori, I think we have a couple of slides on our JM resources.
Yes, thank you, Cory. Thank you very much. There you go. Just wanted to highlight some of the things that we're doing with marketing at JM. One of the things that we launched a few months ago was a Twitter account. It's at Insulation Intel, and it's all things insulation. It's retweets from our associations that we belong to and media partners. It's industry trends. We are trying to engage our contractor audience with a contest that we're doing, that if you post your install, end of the day, you're proud of the installation you did, take a picture of your JM products and post it to Insulation Intel, hashtag Insulation Intel, give us a brief description of what it is. And on a monthly basis, we have a contest that we award a really cool Yeti cooler. Next slide, Cory. Also, the source. This is on our website. We have a source library for all of the insulation businesses, our mechanical insulation, our HVAC, and even our building residential insulation. This page is really helpful go-to place to get information on past webinars, documents. Under the products, you can get all of our data sheets. Well, it'll take you to a product page, and you can get all the data sheets and specification guides and all the information that you might need about JM products. You can change the next slide there, Cory. To get to the source, you can go from any of the industrial insulation, mechanical insulation, any of those product pages, and you can either go directly to the technical documents and the specification tools, or over here on the right, there is the source Insulation Intel, and you can click on that and it'll take you right to that previous page that has the webinars and the documents and all the good things. And I guess now we'll just open it for anybody that's got any questions, Jared.
Thanks, Lori. And Cory, thank you so much. I thought that presentation was fascinating, very, very, very interesting, and very helpful information. So while we're waiting on some questions to come through, and I'll just remind people to submit questions, use the little questions tab on your the GoToWebinar control panel there. But while we're waiting for some questions to come through, not trying to one up you, Lori. You're the source, and your JM resources are outstanding. But I do want to take a second to plug our amazing website, distributioninternational.com. It's a fantastic resource that has a wide range of value-added features, including our customer portal that we call Customer Connect. When you are logged in as a DI customer, you can view past invoices, access pricing, request quotes, and even submit orders all online. Maybe the best feature is a detailed online product catalog of more than 30,000 products. It's easy to search and easy to navigate. And you can also, on the website, you can view our past webinars and view our new blog as well that we've been running for a few months now. So some great content there. So go to distributioninternational.com today. And if you are not registered for Customer Connect, take advantage and do that and make your job easier. Let's see. Here's a question. Well, first, Cory, we have a comment that says thank you for your time and wonderful information. So we do have a question from Mia. She asks, as the economy levels out, which may be even years down the road, do manufacturers, distributors, suppliers, will they ever lower their prices?
Lance, I don't know if you want to take that one from a JM perspective. At least I can take a stab from what I think we're seeing on our space. I would say right now it's a little too early to tell, right? Ultimately, prices are still a function of the supply and demand fundamentals. And as we currently think about this right now, it's going to take some pretty significant changes structurally, right, to either the demand picture or the supply picture to really begin to see, I would say, a material push to change kind of the current state of things. So I would say right now, at least from what we're seeing on the back end as JM, it's not something that we're really encountering at this point, but inevitably at some point, sure, whatever that level looks like, there's a theoretical point at which that could happen. But certainly your comment is valid that in light of today's environment, it's going to be at least multiple years before we kind of come to that position.
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't add much to that. Just to say that we try to obviously keep our customers competitive in the market, which follow those fundamentals that you talked about around supply and demand, and it ebbs and flows over long cycles. So I think the answer to the ever part of that question is some point in the future you would think the cycles will turn. But yeah, there's a lot of structural pressure that Cory just took us through right now.
Hey, Cory, I might mention real quick, this is Eric. The way I kind of view this is the market is always going to determine what the sell price is. And, those functions of supply and demand are probably going to drive that. I think long term, possibly there might be some kind of a change in the momentum of the way the price is going. But, I think there are things that are fundamentally changed. One of them is transportation and logistics. I mean, a year or two ago, you probably could have imported a container from China or from Europe for, maybe $1,000, $2,000 a container. Now we're seeing quotes upwards of $18,000, $19,000, $20,000. I don't think that's going back to, $2,000. I think that's changed. This driver shortage that you spoke to, that is definitely coming down the pike. And, when you have all these drivers that are, 55 age and older that are going to be retiring out, you got a real problem with transportation. I just do not see some of the freight rates that we've seen in the last 6 months or so, or just you would never have thought about that even a couple of years ago. And so I see some of these things just not changing. And again, the market will determine what the price is, but right now I certainly don't see any momentum where that's coming back the other way.
And Cory, this is Jared. Just kind of a comment and question from me. One thing that I think is very applicable to our industry, and certainly to DI as a distributor and JM as a manufacturer, we kind of saw this with lumber, where the commodity price skyrocketed, and then the commodity price went down, and then the consumer is still paying the higher price because the people they're buying it from purchased it at the higher price. Can you speak a little bit to that dynamic?
Yeah, sure. And certainly there are going to be markets that are inherently more volatile than others. Lumber is a great example of that, Jared. I think, we've seen it get as high as $1,600 a random board length, go back down to 400. And I think as of last week, it's up back to 1,200. That's always going to occur, right? Within a liquid marketplace, it's really just going to be about the severity and the degrees of severity that are inherently locked up. So, as you go to market, as you're trying to source product, you're consistently trying to find a way to align the needs of your end customer with the way you buy, right? And so in some cases, that volatility is accepted, and that's something that we work well on. In some cases, we'll take smoothing strategies out where perhaps we're paying a bit of a premium in the short term for a little more stability. That's all going to be a function of the market that we're playing in, and it's only going to be a function of the inherent volatility that the business, both consumer and an ultimate customer, is able to sign up for it and willing to sign up for. But no, very much we do see that. Aluminum is another good example. Interesting, today's market, there's always a need to try to find ways to work throughout those volatilities, those peaks and troughs, to bring as much stability to the customers as we possibly can.
Great, thanks. We don't have any other questions right now. I will just say for our customers that are on this webinar, first of all, thank you for joining. But I want to say that I'm really proud of some of the folks here at Distribution International on our sourcing team and at the senior leadership level, and you guys at JM know this. DI works hand in hand very, very closely with all of our suppliers to work through all of these challenges, and we do so purely with what's best for our customers in mind. And I'm proud of the relationships we have with JM and with all of our suppliers, and how we work together to try to overcome these challenges and get our customers the products they need when they need it. So really proud of the relationship that DI has with our suppliers and the efforts we take to overcome these challenges. So with that, thank you everybody for joining. Thanks again to Cory and Eric and Lori and everybody at JM for your time today. Really appreciate this topic. I think it was fantastic. We had a lot of people on this webinar, and that just shows the interest level in this topic. So we are recording the webinar. You can check distributioninternational.com in the next few days, and we'll have it posted. If you go to distributioninternational.com under resources and click on DI 101 webinar series, and you'll see some little links to the recordings of this and other past webinars. So check that out. Follow us on LinkedIn and on YouTube. And with that, I will wish everybody enjoy the rest of your week, and have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.